Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Nearly a year after applying to join NATO, Finland has become the alliance's 31st member. But the country that pushed Helsinki to abandon its decades of neutrality is not pleased. Not long after the Finnish flag was unfurled at NATO's headquarters in Brussels, Russia warned the accession was a dangerous historic mistake that would weaken regional security. Moscow went further, saying the risk of conflict has now increased and it would be forced to take countermeasures. Russia and Finland share a 1,300-kilometer-long border, which the Kremlin says has been reinforced in response to NATO's expansion. Last year, Russia launched an attack on Ukraine to protest what it said was the alliance's encroachment on its territory. In response, Finland and Sweden both applied to join NATO. Last week, Turkiye's parliament ratified Finland's bid, but not Sweden's, due to what Ankara says was the country's failure to crack down on terror groups. So how will Russia respond to Finland's accession, and how will NATO react? And to further discuss Russia's reaction to Finland joining NATO, joining me now from Oslo is Glenn Diesen. He is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And from Washington, D.C., Sean Michael Cox. He is a senior advisor at the Global Policy Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So Finland has become the 31st member of NATO, greatly expanding the alliance's border with Russia. Glenn, how significant is this, and what do you make of the reaction from Kremlin, in which it said it would take countermeasures against Finland's entry into NATO?
Well, the countermeasures would be quite predictable because with this expansion, NATO opens up a 1,340-kilometer-long new front line against Russia, a border which has for decades now been considered to be peaceful, given that Finland has been neutral. So I think over time, Russia will react very negatively to it. So they have to strike a balance, of course. They have to find a way of deterring NATO without putting so much weapons on the border that NATO feels a need to deter Russia and thereby having an arms race or an arms build-up on the border. But of course, you can't expand these military lines up to Russia's border without expecting some repercussion. So again, from my perspective, I think this is incredibly provocative. Mm-hmm. One can only imagine if a Russian or Chinese military alliance would expand into Mexico and establish itself there on the American border. So it will definitely have a strong response from Moscow, at least over time, as it builds up its defenses in the northwest.
So, Sean, Russian President Putin, before the Nordic countries made their bids to join NATO, had said it was not a problem for Russia as long as they didn't set up military infrastructure next to its borders. So how is that going to play out now?
Well, I think when the initial applications were made last year in 2022, the Russian government and President Putin in particular were underselling the impact of having both Finland and Sweden potentially join NATO. They wanted to project that whatever happened in the expansion of NATO, that it wouldn't have any kind of negative effect on the plans that Russia had for its defenses and for its posture in Eastern Europe. Now, of course, since Finland has joined, we've heard from the Kremlin spokesperson that these military and tactical changes that are going to be made sound a bit more aggressive. And what I think we can expect in the short term, at least, is Russia to make more aggressive comments about Finland joining and about the threat that NATO represents potentially to Russia. Most of it is just a smokescreen for them to try and figure out how they're going to react to this in the medium to long term. And it all, of course, plays in the backdrop of what's happening with Russia in Ukraine, which is, of course, still an ongoing concern.
So, Glenn, Russia said Finland's entry into NATO won't impact its ongoing war in Ukraine. But could that change? I mean, as Sean mentioned a little, could Russia take its anger out of NATO by especially escalating the war in Ukraine?
Well, a lot of this is rhetoric, because if Russia would go out very hard against Finland and warn it, then or even threaten Finland, then this would be seen as being an aggressive act on Russia's part, and then NATO would, they might call in American troops to position themselves on the border to contain Russia. On the other hand, if they're underselling it, saying it's not that big of a deal for us, then NATO will say, well, we're not a threat to Russia. We can continue to build up. So there's no good way really for Russia out of this, which has always been this problem vis-a-vis NATO. But regarding Ukraine, I don't think it will impact the war much in Ukraine. The only aspect is that any possible negotiations seem to be more or less gone, because for Russia, it's a reason for invading Ukraine is because it couldn't live with NATO in Ukraine along the Black Sea coast on the Russian border. Now, by expanding NATO into Finland, we're very clearly communicating to the Russians that there will be no common peace, no peace agreement for peaceful coexistence in Europe. So,
yes.
So we kind of remove this whole aspect as a possible bargaining chip. There's no more expansionism in return for Russian concessions. So now I think they will just go for full victory.
So, Sean, how do you think Finland will act in the short future? And for example, will Finland accept foreign troops on its soil or even nuclear weapons belonging to its allies? I mean, how will its integration with NATO's infrastructure be sorted out? I mean, will Finland try to strike a balance between NATO and Russia?
Well, Finland has always maintained a very independent pose and posture in the Nordic region because of the tradition of standing up to the Soviet Union during the so-called Winter War at the height of World War II. They have proudly maintained their independent ability to counteract a Soviet and later a Russian threat. But the fact of the matter is that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Finland has essentially been aligned with the NATO and European security arrangement. So they have worked side by side and in tandem with them. Finland joining NATO is more a technicality really than anything else that allows them to bring in new troops from other countries in support of their efforts to protect their border with Russia. But I don't think in the short term or even in the medium term that there will be any fundamental or significant change to Finland's posture vis-a-vis Russia along its own border. There's just no cause for it. If Russia reacts in a way that's unexpected and becomes much more threatening, then that's potentially could be a game changer. For example, there is the whole Kaliningrad scenario that could play out there with Russia will be a threat to not just Finland, but to other Nordic countries as well.
Glenn, how would that impact Russia's naval operations in the Baltic Sea when Finnish ports, airspace, and sea lanes are open to NATO? I mean, will nuclear weapons assume a greater prominence in the Russian strategy?
Well, when Finland and Sweden put in their application to join NATO, the former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, he went out and said that in any future conflict now NATO had a huge advantage, a conflict in the Baltics, because now they could put a full blockade on St. Petersburg in the Baltic Sea. So obviously, any attack from NATO against Russia in the future, efforts to contain it in this region, well, it very radically increased that capability now. So this is, of course, something that Russia will have to respond to. It will have to develop the necessary capabilities in order to deter any such acts from NATO. So again, this is part of the problem of ending neutrality. This is during the Cold War, we had this belt of neutral states running from the north down to the south in Europe, which were meant to reduce tensions. Now, by rolling up NATO right on the Russian border, they will have to increase the deterrent, and then of course NATO will also have to do the same. So there's a good chance this could spin out of control.
So, Sean, on top of Finland's membership, Japan has announced it will open a diplomatic mission in NATO. What do you make of this decision? I mean, how is Western-led institutions' efforts to shore up alliances in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, and South Korea coming along? I mean, is the balance of power shifting in that region as well?
Well, leaders of Western countries and NATO members have made no secret that they are looking to shore up the military cooperation between the greater powers in the Indo-Pacific and NATO. Overtures have been made to New Zealand, to Australia, to South Korea, and to Japan. The opening up of a full diplomatic mission on the part of Japan to NATO directly just further solidifies this shifting interest. Obviously, China is a concern for countries like the United States, in what they're doing in the Indo-Pacific region and in East Asia. And now with Finland joining NATO, Russia is going to be looking to support its own interests by making a potentially stronger alliance with China, which does need to be counteracted in the East as well as in the West.
So, Glenn, I mean, how would these Western-led institutions weaken the regional security from not only Russia, but from China's point of view?
Well, during times of conflict, there's always this push for greater solidarity. And obviously, now that we have this conflict with Russia, the Americans have been able to use this also to get to get the Europeans on board on a more anti-Chinese policy as well. So we saw this now in NATO's recent security concept, where they're also now listing China as this security challenge. So I think this is part of again, this is the purpose of NATO. It's facilitating the U.S. hegemony and military. So I think this will be a pathway to using NATO more, also to go after China or contain the Chinese. So it's, from that aspect, I agree. It's quite natural for NATO to reach out to Japan and other countries in the East in order to go for this global NATO to also seek to confront China.
So, Sean, I really wonder about your opinion on this. Just days after Finland joined NATO following Turkiye's, of course, ratification, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was in Turkiye and Ankara to meet with his Turkish counterpart. But the two ministers didn't really touch on Finland's membership into NATO. It seems Russia has moved on. Does that seem like the real case here?
I think, again, Russia is trying to strike this balance between downplaying the significance of Finland joining NATO with them wanting to stand up to what they see as a more aggressive posturing by NATO. So, of course, when they have a strategy of trying to peel away member countries from their obligations with their alliances, they're not going to indicate that this is a big deal for them. Russia has worked very keenly over the past 2 decades to drive wedges between alliance members in NATO and EU partners as well. So they're not going to come and talk to Turkey and say, oh, we're very concerned about what's happening in Finland. What can you do about it? When they're talking to Turkey and they're negotiating the issues they have with Turkey and what to do, for example, in the Black Sea region, they're not going to highlight any of the issues that might be of concern to them to Finland, because it may make them look weaker in the eyes of the Turks that they're negotiating with. All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.